Welcome to the Sacramentalists, a podcast where the ancient Christian faith is brought to bear on issues prevalent in modern culture. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
I'm Father Creighton McElveen.
I'm Father Hayden Butler.
And I think today we might be setting a record because this might be the fastest we've ever had a guest back after their initial interview. And that guest is Dr. Tom Ward, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University. We had Dr. Ward on earlier this semester to talk about his book on Duns Scotus called Ordered by Love, which was a great conversation. And if you haven't listened to that, you should pause, go listen to that, and then come back to this episode. But today we're excited to have him on to discuss his book, After Stoicism, Last Words of the Last Roman Philosopher, which is a guide through Boethius's masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. Dr. Ward, welcome back, and thanks for returning. How have you been since the last time we talked, which was not that long ago?
Well, it's great to be back, and things are going well. Been right in the middle of teaching a seminar on Boethius and a survey of early modern philosophy, and I'm currently in the middle of trying to teach Kant. So at the moment, not doing great, but in general, since the last time, things have been good.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So maybe before we jump into the actual book itself, could you give our listeners a little background about Boethius, also known as Saint Severinus? Who was he? Why did he write The Consolation of Philosophy? Was he a Christian or was he a pagan? These kind of basic questions about him.
Excellent. Yeah. So Saint Severinus Boethius was a early 6th century philosopher and theologian who was also a Roman senator. He was based in Rome and was trying to work for the good of what had been the empire under the rule of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. And he was a patriot who tried to serve his country. He was also a Christian who tried to serve the church through some of his theological writings, getting involved in controversies like the Monophysite controversy about the dual natures and one person of Christ. But he was eventually accused of treason by some of Theodoric's supporters. They persuaded Theodoric that he was a traitor. The charges were not particularly good. It seems almost like guilt by association. Another senator named Albinus was accused of treason, and maybe was trying to get the Eastern Empire to come and retake the Italian peninsula. But Boethius stood up in his defense and said that he was not, in fact, a traitor. And as a result of that defense of his friend, it probably was the main reason why Boethius was sentenced to death ultimately. And while in some sort of prison circumstances, probably not a dungeon, maybe something like house arrest, Boethius composed The Consolation of Philosophy. Yeah, so you asked the question in a way that about Boethius's life in a way that was somewhat provocative, because the only reason there's any kind of question about Boethius's Christianity is because The Consolation of Philosophy is not an explicitly Christian book, at least with regards to its content. There's nothing about it that, if you knew nothing else about the author, that would make you think, oh, this person must have been a Christian. Now, there's very little in it that is incompatible with Christianity, and it's really some of the poetic themes that Boethius draws from classical literature. So it's not clear that he's asserting some of these incompatible views as though he believes them. Might be more of a figurative devices. But in any case, it's the lack of explicit Christian theology in The Consolation of Philosophy that gives some people pause, because after all, if this Christian theologian were suffering in prison and knew he was about to die, why wouldn't he, if he sets down to write anything, why wouldn't he write something that expressed explicitly a Christian worldview? So that's the puzzle about Boethius. Nevertheless, taking his whole life into account, especially I think the theological tractates and some circumstantial evidence that he was closely involved in theological controversies in support of the church until late in his career, that we have good reason to think that whatever the ultimate answer is about the theological content of the Consolation of Philosophy, the author who wrote it was indeed a Christian. And certainly the people in Pavia, Italy, which is the city he died in, thought that they had a martyr on their hands, and he's been venerated in Pavia for centuries and centuries. And at least I don't know how the Anglicans treat him, but at least in the Roman Catholic Church, he's not on the universal calendar, but his in the late 19th century, his cultus was confirmed by an act of the Pope, and so we can say Saint Severinus, even though here in the United States there's nowhere where you would be permitted to celebrate Mass in honor of him.
Sadly, I don't believe he's made it onto our calendar, but maybe we can put in a petition to change that at some point.
Though widely appreciated, as far as I know, everyone seems to speak glowingly of him when they're aware of him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe before we jump in a little more about the book, Consolation, we could talk about your book and kind of what brought it about. Why did you publish this for Word on Fire Academic? What did you see in our contemporary landscape that made you think Boethius was worth recovering?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. The book is called After Stoicism, and the name Boethius isn't in the title or subtitle, but as you know, Boethius is sometimes thought of as the last of the Romans and the first of the medievals. So he's indirectly named in the title, but I've been teaching the Consolation of Philosophy for a long time, and there is a strong Stoic element to the book, and a lot of the advice of lady philosophy to the prisoner Boethius really is just channeling a lot of the great wisdom of Stoic philosophers. And yet the book is not merely a Stoic treatise. It goes far beyond what the Stoics thought that we could reasonably hope for in terms of our desire for happiness and the possibility of achieving it. So I was interested in that way in which Boethius surpasses in lots of ways the Stoics. And I wanted to write it now because I had noticed both from my students and also poking around online that there does seem to be this recovery of interest in Stoicism in a certain subclass. I think mostly it's sort of young men or tech professionals, people who are either both really busy and probably feel modern life as involving lots of compulsions and perhaps a kind of banality. And so there's this return to Stoicism as a kind of I want to reach for a word like tough here or something like that. It's a tough philosophy in the sense that it to the extent that we pursue Stoic virtue and cultivate detachment from things that ultimately are not of true value, that we gain a kind of spiritual or moral toughness that helps us to navigate the suffering of the world, the frustrations of the world in a way that is noble. And so I noticed that this was becoming more popular and thought that's great in so many ways, but I don't want people to stay there. And so I was hoping to make some sort of contribution to this revival of Stoicism that affirmed everything that I thought was worth affirming in Stoicism, but also presented something that goes beyond Stoicism. And in that way, it's actually a kind of evangelistic effort, because the way in which Boethius goes beyond Stoicism is by offering a vision of a providential God who desires our happiness and in union with whom we can indeed be happy. So that's what I wanted to invite any sort of Stoic interested person, man or woman, by the way, it's not just a man thing, to try Boethius. So I had this idea, and then the Word on Fire people liked my SCOTUS book, the Ordered by Love book. So I got contacted out of the blue, and they asked, "Do you have anything that you could write that's roughly at the level of the SCOTUS book, but on some other topic?" I thought, well, I have just the pitch. So I pitched this to the editor on a phone call. And he says, "I can't believe what I'm hearing, because the editors, my co-editors and I at Word on Fire Academic, we just finished one of these really popular Stoicism books because we were interested in trying to figure out why this is trending. And we were so disappointed in it that as a kind of palate cleanser, we all started reading the Consolation of Philosophy." So literally they were thinking exactly the sort of content that I was thinking of as I was starting to plan out the book. So they were excited about the project, and we rushed it in a way because we were hoping to get it out by October of this year, which we did, to mark the 1500th anniversary of Boethius's martyrdom. So 524 in Pavia, Italy, Boethius died, and October 23rd. So we marked that. The book came out, I think, that week officially, and that's that. So it almost felt, the Consolation of Philosophy deals with the theme of providence, as you all know. So the coming together of this book felt providential, the way that Word on Fire contacted me out of the blue, and then the visions aligned so well. So it really felt like I was meant to do it.
Well, it's a fantastic book, and I will say, after talking to you the last time, I was able to read it kind of in your voice in my head the whole time. It was delightful. What are some of the things when you look out at this kind of modern revival of Stoicism? I mean, certainly there are things we can commend. There is a kind of asceticism in Stoicism that's positive, but what are some of the sort of negative reasons why it's not good for people to just stay there? Why do they need to move into something deeper?
Yeah, good. There's a certain kind of logic to Stoicism that does feel compelling in a lot of ways. The idea is that we live in a world over which we have very little control. We ourselves are mortal. Everything that we interact with in our day-to-day lives is either mortal or ephemeral in some way. We're bound to lose so many things that we are disposed to love. Losing these goods makes us sad. So what hope do we have for a happy life? Well, the Stoics think not much. In fact, if you really want to be happy, you're bound to be miserable. The best that we can hope for is something like serenity. And the Stoic word for this is ataraxia. Now, in order to achieve this serenity, again, not happiness, but just sort of even keel, tranquil, in order to achieve that, we have to cultivate detachment, apatheia, from where we get our word apathy. This detachment from these things that we can lose, and focus instead on the things that we can't lose. And there is an important sense, I think the Stoics are basically right about this, that one of the things we can't lose is ourselves. Of course, we're mortal, but as long as we're alive, we're stuck with ourselves. So if we can cultivate virtue, then we can become, so to speak, a reasonably good companion to ourselves. And insofar as we pursue the virtues and try to live virtuously, we are exercising the maximal degree of mastery over our lives as this mortal veil permits us. And I think there's just a lot of wisdom in that. I think where it goes wrong, though, is that this call to give up on happiness in favor of tranquility, I think, is a kind of psychological violence. And what I mean by that is that it might be possible to train yourself to give up on happiness, but that is really a kind of despair. Human longing and even the structure of human action aim not at tranquility, not at the absence of suffering, but at something positive, happiness. And so in order to become the Stoic master, you have to do violence to, you have to reprogram or reconfigure your own psychology to aim at something much lower than what you in fact aim at by nature. And that's, I think, the insight of Boethius, as he so obviously respects these Stoic thinkers who came before him, but really is not content with mere tranquility, and so offers a kind of program for moving through a sort of Stoic catechesis where we learn how to detach ourselves from the things that we are bound to lose, so that in losing them we're not made miserable, but doesn't leave us there. It says, instead of, once you have this apatheia, getting ataraxia, achieving ataraxia, instead there we can look to the true eternal goods that really can make us happy. And that begins the more Platonic / Christian theme of the Consolation of Philosophy, moving beyond Stoicism, but moving through Stoicism.
It seems that part of that project in the Consolation is signaled by what you hinted at earlier, the literary quality of it and the use of figurative language, poetry, sort of poetry, classical allusion, but that even the way that Boethius, as the protagonist of the Consolation, and Lady Philosophy are figured, gives a sense to the project at hand, which is to sort of upset the finality of tranquility. There's a deferred kind of quality to both of them, that there's something beyond the encounter they're having in the house there, and philosophy is always sort of something present to him, but also something far away from him at the same time, that draws him constantly kind of beyond his moment there. And I think it's hinting at what you just said. It's that oh no, there's actually an end to which that desire is properly ordered, and that can actually requite it. So I'm curious if with that as the way of preface to a question, it seems that Lady Philosophy emerges in the Consolation in this kind of paradoxical way, which maybe there are three ways of looking at it here. One would be that she looks youthful, but she's actually very aged. On the other hand, she sort of presents as being of normal stature, and yet her head is always in the clouds. And then also her dress is woven of these sort of fine materials, but it's also been ripped up at the same time. So it's finery that has been sort of, that violence has been done to in some way. And it strikes me that this is a way of kind of capturing that something has drawn near, but there's also a paradoxical quality to her that constantly is deferring us beyond her, or making us ask a question that makes us go onward and onward and onward, and not settle for what's happening just in that very moment, which paradox tends to do. Can you help us get deeper into that? Why is philosophy sort of figured the way she is, and what does that contribute to that project?
Yeah, what a wonderful, rich question, and maybe we should just talk this through, because I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is we might think of these paradoxes as somehow generated by the quality of Boethius's own vision. In other words, his relationship to philosophy, in the state that he is in, as someone who, having been unjustly or unfairly, to his mind at least, imprisoned and sentenced to death, he's full of despair, he's miserable. he's weeping when Lady Philosophy enters the room, and partly it's literally the way that the water is blocking his vision, that he can't recognize Lady Philosophy at first. But I wonder if going beyond that, the paradoxes of her appearance maybe are due to his not at that state having the philosophical disposition or the right relationship to philosophy. But then I think, and this is maybe a little bit more on the theme that you're picking up, which is that maybe there's something about philosophy itself that is paradoxical. So in other words, Boethius needs to achieve a better relationship with philosophy. So that's the sort of correcting of his own vision. But then philosophy itself can't nail down with pure demonstrative precision answers to all of life's biggest questions. And so there's something about the nature of philosophy itself that no matter how clear Boethius's vision is, where it's still going to have some sort of paradoxical quality about it, because reason can't ultimately get to a fully satisfying answer on questions like why does God allow me to suffer if he loves me so much? Why does it appear that the wicked prosper and the just suffer if God himself is supposed to be just? And questions like that, where we can get the beginning of an answer from philosophy, but not an answer that fully satisfies. So that's just maybe two layer kind of thinking about these paradoxes. But I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I think it's just such a rich question.
No, what your answer, it creates a follow-up question in my mind, which is, it seems like that's, just in the imagery of that first encounter, there's that signal to the kind of the need for that cultivation of apatheia and ataraxia, right? Where I'm crying, I can't see, I need to actually get clear eyes to look on philosophy, and I'm looking at philosophy, and later on, and by the fifth movement, we're now actually just talking face to face, and we're having a very cogent, tranquil conversation. But even then, there is that kind of deferred quality there. It seems like you really drew out, and I'm curious for you to say more about this, that there is a way of the way we experience the consolation is at some level within that kind of subjective experience of Boethius, as he is going from a kind of incapacity for even doing philosophy to a kind of neutral gear where philosophy becomes possible. Maybe you could say more about that, because that's a really sophisticated kind of like literary and narrative technique. Can you draw out a little bit more about how you see that emerging in the text?
Yeah. I won't be able to demonstrate this, so I'm going to give a kind of big picture reading, and then you tell me what you think of it, or if I've left something out that okay. But here's the thought. So you have Boethius the author, you have Boethius the character, who's sometimes they called just simply the prisoner, and then you have the character of philosophy, or Lady Philosophy as we call her. And so Lady Philosophy takes the prisoner through this sort of therapeutic deconstructive program of detaching him from goods of fortune, and then a more constructive program of instilling in him this rational hope in God and the possibility of happiness in God, and then considering various objections or challenges to that picture of God and happiness, and trying to walk Boethius through there. All right, and then we get to the end of book 5, and the final question concerns the possibility of human freedom in light of God's foreknowledge of everything that will happen. Foreknowledge itself is supposed to come out of God's providential plan. The providential plan was supposed to be comforting. because even when things seem to be going badly for us, they're not really, because God has this plan. But then that raises this potential challenge to human freedom. And if we're not free, then maybe life will feel meaningless, or something like that. Okay, so Lady Philosophy gives her answer, and presuming that I think that it will satisfy Boethius the prisoner. She says, now, basically, since we've solved the problem, let's offer our place our hope and our and prayers to God, and acknowledging that we need His grace, and that we'll stand before Him in judgment someday, and so on. And then the book just ends. We get no reply from Boethius. So the sort of really speculative kind of reading here is that what the whole dialogue is, in one sense, taking place in the head of the author/narrator.
Mm-hmm.
And Philosophy and Boethius, the prisoner, are sort of merging into one. So that as Lady Philosophy is speaking at the end, the reason there's no reply is because Boethius himself, Boethius the prisoner, has taken on the life of the philosopher once more. And it is satisfying, it's consoling, and yet it's not complete. It's not completely consoling. So then there's this sort of, philosophy has done its job. Boethius is now a kind of reintegrated self, and now he's prepared to offer prayers as he awaits judgment after death.
Wow.
So that's my big wild reading.
No, that comports, and the fact that it doesn't include a sort of response at the end. There's that harmony, that sort of the integration work at the end. But then that integrated person isn't at an end yet, because there's that action yet to be accomplished, which is prayer, right? Which is
yes,
a fascinating way to end a philosophical exercise, is with prayer.
Yes.
We could certainly see a lot of parallels between this and like the Phaedo or something like that, but I also think there's maybe biblically a parallel between this and Job, because that's kind of how Job ends, right? I mean, Job ends with God's speech to Job, and Job just kind of is silent at the end because there's nothing more to say.
Right.
And then, but that's not the end of the Job story. There's still more that happens to him after that. He still has a life he has to lead. But I think there's some parallel there as well. It's not just Socratic imagery. I think there's some biblical imagery there as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
I think too, one of the things we see, so if you look at Aquinas and his project with the Summa, I mean, in one sense, he's sort of like, he's saying there's this philosophical journey that we need to go down. It's in a different mode than the way Boethius is dealing with this. It's not sort of narrative, but he's like, how many things can we answer with philosophy? What's the process here? And then that moves him into a massive work on theology. And then look at the end of his life, where he looks at it all and he says, well, now it's kind of beyond me. This is kind of past what I thought it would be. And there's this sort of prayerful letting go of the work in Aquinas. It's straw. Not that it's bad or wrong, but it's moving from... It's kind of moving along that journey that philosophy takes us towards reintegration, which leads us into this sort of contemplation of what makes us happy, which is ultimately God himself. The only logical end to that is prayer, adoration, contemplation, presence. It's a really kind of beautiful progress.
Yeah, I like that analogy, and I especially like that famous line about how Aquinas realized at the end of his life that everything that he'd done was straw. I mean, it doesn't imply, I don't think, that, as you seem to agree, that everything that he had done was worthless. It's just, it's in comparison to what is beginning to be revealed to him at the end of his life, and what he really hopes for, what he will achieve, by God's grace in the beatific vision. Compared with that, all of the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles is nothing, but it can still be useful as a way of getting yourself to that point of abandoning yourself to God and placing your hope for happiness in God, and offering prayer to achieve salvation instead of trying to get it on your own. It's nice comparison. I hadn't thought of that.
I sort of see this with the going back to Stoicism. It's sort of in pop culture. How many thousands of TikToks and Instagram reels are there of some talking head sitting there saying, "Well, have you thought about Stoicism?" And it's the one of the things that I think is interesting there is they might correctly diagnose a problem maybe in sort of modern life, but they're sort of stopping 2 stops down the track instead of continuing on the train towards the ultimate fulfillment of the journey. It's almost like a philosophical band-aid to the problem right now, rather than completing the therapy, which I think Boethius is doing. I mean, I think that's the whole point, is he's giving us this sort of example, which is why I think the ending of it is so deeply Christian. It's so it's so much there to say philosophy is so great. It helps us understand these things. It helps us investigate virtue. It helps us do this. But one of my favorite professors in undergrad used to say, the project of philosophy is always a journey.
Yeah.
But it's a journey with an endpoint, with an actual endpoint, towards our happiness and fulfillment and ultimate good. And I think that's kind of where people today are sort of missing the key. They're stopping early.
Yeah, and this gets back maybe a little bit to the theme of philosophy's paradoxical quality that Father Hayden was mentioning. There's, if you're looking to philosophy the way that some people do, at least as they start out, like what is my philosophy, or what's my school? What school of philosophy or ideology do I support? And then you choose one that you like, that resonates somehow with you. If you think of philosophy like that, you stop. You're not operating as a true philosopher, because your philosophical journey simply comes to an end, and then you sort of wear your ideology and you go through life, and maybe it helps you, maybe it doesn't. Whereas I think there's something about philosophy that, even though you can make progress, there is such a thing as a good argument, and at the same time, there's something that's never ending about philosophy as such. And yet our own lives have ends, and the structure of our desiring and our acting is goal oriented. So like, there's something about philosophy that just is not well suited to be the be all and end all. It's just that it's that thing that we pursue it one way, and then we consider another objection, and it keeps going, and we're making progress, but philosophy itself will never come to an end. And so if we are to achieve our end through philosophy, not everyone does. People can become saints without ever studying philosophy, of course, but if you're sort of disposed to be philosophical, the only thing it can do for you is keep you restless, answering questions as they come up, but then generating new ones, and that's just never ending through life. And it can't do for us what a lot of people want it to do for us. And yet, you mentioned the TikToks and all that, the YouTube philosophy and that sort of thing. I think this attraction to Stoicism, I think there really is something honorable about it. We could diagnose problems of modern life in terms of materialism, which might come more to mind as the sort of thing that Stoicism would offer an antidote to. But there's this other side of it that I wonder might be actually driving modern attraction to Stoicism more, and that's something like the way in which so many aspects of modern life feel compulsive, especially related to screen stuff, whether that's just sort of like dopamine addiction that social media scrolling gives you, or whether it's something more pernicious like a pornography addiction, or like wasting way too many hours a day playing video games or something like that. A life that is compulsive, where so much of it is lived in this compulsive way, feels degrading and is degrading. And I think that a lot of people sort of find themselves in that bad place and want to get out of it and aren't sure. And the thought of, the Stoic call to gain a kind of control of yourself, and in so doing, you can detach yourself from things that don't ultimately matter, use them as tools or whatever to achieve your ends, but you're no longer a slave, and so you lose that degrading aspect of a lot of modern life. And what I hope is that is the, that sort of recognition is all to the good, as and hopefully that is disposing a lot of people to then consider what might lie beyond merely the gaining of self-mastery, which after all is not the be-all and end-all of human life. It's, in one important way, being mastered by something that is infinitely above us.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting sort of way to look at it. And I worry too about the sort of commoditization of philosophy nowadays, where it's an attempt to answer the question, and it's like, well, I can sort of pick the philosophy that I want, that resonates the most with what I need, and then you're both stuck, but you're also sort of then contributing to that ongoing sense of angst and dislocation. It's because I just picked the philosophy that I liked. It's like one of many on a shelf that I can go buy, and that seems contrary to what Boethius, and sort of back to the text, is presenting with his engagement and relationship to Lady Philosophy.
She calls out the Stoic and Epicurean herds, who tear at her dress like just a little piece of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that's supposed to be compatible with Lady Philosophy's approval of individual Stoic philosophers. So it's not that she's dismissing Stoicism as such. She's dismissing that exactly that mindset. I love this phrase, the commodification of philosophy. And it's very nice. But yeah, I think that's exactly what Lady Philosophy is addressing there in book one.
Kind of related to the commodification question, but I think it's slightly different. And I should preface this by making it very clear that I am not in any way anti-therapy. I've used therapy. I find it to be a great tool. I'm very thankful for the therapists that I have worked with. But there's been a lot of ink spilled about the oversaturation of sort of therapeutic culture. And I remember seeing this a couple of years ago. I remember talking to someone who was sort of adjacent to our parish, and we were talking about the sacrament of confession. And I kind of explained it to her, and she said, "Oh, well, I already go to therapy," as if they were interchangeable. But in this book, you propose, and I think rightfully so, that philosophy plays a kind of therapeutic role. So how is the kind of therapy that Lady Philosophy offers different and or deeper from that which we encounter in a sort of therapeutic culture?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I can't speak to all of this therapeutic culture. I certainly agree with the assessment that there is something that's like overly therapeutic about our current situation. And my own limited experience, has been mixed. I think that there is a tendency in therapeutic contexts to, in some ways offer challenges to the patient, but to sort of leave. I think there's a tendency for the patient to think of his or her own situation as of really central importance to the universe. and I wonder if that kind of me first or self-care before others care is really a kind of problem for the therapeutic movement. And there are commercial interests here to keep patients intensely interested in their own kind of progress. If you keep going to the therapist and you get to think about yourself over and over and over again. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that there's a loss of authority and there's a loss of meaning. And so people do look to therapists as trying to give them some way of making sense out of their lives. Hopefully pastors will take that role more and more. And again, I'm speaking a little bit out of ignorance here, where the line is between sort of medical, clinical things and just moral, spiritual things, and how to draw that line and who's needed for what. And I'm not an expert, so it's just all by way of clarification, or qualification. But there is a therapeutic quality to Lady Philosophy's work on Boethius, in that he is depressed. He's miserable. Maybe he's terrified. He's complaining in the very first opening poem. He is complaining that death has not come for him. Is he suicidal or just throwing the most massive pity party ever? I don't know. Maybe both. So he is the perfect candidate, so to speak, for a therapeutic intervention. But then if you look at what Lady Philosophy does for him, it is importantly not self-centered. She wants him to lose his attachment to goods. She wants him to understand the ultimate source of his happiness and his making sense of the world as something outside of himself, rather than some sort of inner resources that he might have or that she might somehow unlock for him. It's turning his eyes upward. There's lots of imagery about looking down and looking up. He's looking literally, his face is down to the ground in the opening, and then in the final passage, there's this yet another call to turn our eyes upward. So he's getting outside of himself. But in the course of all that, of course, he has improved his own condition. He has become less self-pitying. He has recovered. I think it's more of a recovery rather than acquisition. The virtues that he once had, in some sort of incomplete way. He's becoming, a nobler person over the course of the dialogue, and is ready to transcend himself at the end. And so in that sense, I think, insofar as we might think of modern therapeutic culture as self-absorbed, in that way, I think the Consolation of Philosophy is rather different. But in the sense that, with the question, can philosophy play this role for us of helping us to make sense of our lives, to integrate aspects of our lives that often seem in competition with each other, and to help us avoid despair and misery? Yeah, I think to that extent, I think Lady Philosophy is trying to do for Boethius what a lot of modern psychologists and therapists are trying to do for their patients. That's a sort of rambling answer, but I wanted the therapeutic language in my own book as a description of what Boethius is doing. I mean it. It's not ironic, but as a way of signaling both the points of convergence with modern therapeutic culture, but also in a kind of provocative or subversive way, suggesting that there's a different direction that we ought to go than what we find. And also, by way of sort of walking back maybe some of my earlier, perhaps maybe too reckless words, maybe we should draw a distinction between the sort of phenomena that we group together when we talk about a therapeutic culture, and the sorts of things that individual therapists or psychologists might be trying to do for their patients. And with regard to the latter, I don't know very much about that. I have personally limited experience, and so maybe I shouldn't offer any sort of really condemning or disparaging words about that. But about therapeutic culture, the sort of me first, self-care, over and over and over again, that your struggles with mental health are totally debilitating and you've got to identify yourself with them, and that sort of culture I do take issue with, and I think it's harmful for people.
Yeah, I think that sort of what came to my mind was the idea of sort of like what is true love in a Christian context, but love of other and sort of getting outside of yourself. And to bring up Aquinas again, this is where Aquinas kind of goes to say that's how you understand self-love, is to like get outside of yourself, to love others. And so within that sort of therapeutic language, it seems like for Boethius, it's that getting outside of himself, looking up rather than looking down, and sort of going on that journey of rediscovering, maybe reacquiring those virtues. But he has to go sort of, again, he has to go on a journey. Lady philosophy has to sort of shepherd him through understanding the different types of goods. And so there is sort of a distinction that's made between the goods that come from fortune versus those that come from virtue. And that distinction is sort of found between felicity and beatitude. And so I think this is sort of a good place to kind of move into that part of the text. So how can we tell the difference between those two things, those kind of two types of goods?
Yeah, good. So Boethius has two words that we could translate as happiness, as you mentioned, felicity and beatitude, or their Latin transliterations. And beatitude is supposed to mark the happiness that we truly seek, this sort of deeper thing, and we could talk about that in a minute. And then felicity is supposed to be more like when we're feeling good, when we're just sort of in a good mood. And part of the reason for marking that distinction is because, who doesn't like to be in a good mood? Of course that's attractive, that's desirable. But one thing about felicity is that you actually don't have very much control over whether you are experiencing felicity. If you are there, a life of virtue might keep you from, let's say if you're a very temperate person, you're not going to eat until you're in pain. You're going to get good sleep. You're not going to drink too much or do bad drugs. And so in all of these ways, you'll be, on the whole, a more felicitous person than someone who's too indulgent in those ways. So virtue might help you with regard to felicity, but ultimately you can't totally immunize yourself against other people's nastiness, or getting sick, or losing other people, other people whom you love getting harmed, or of course dying. So you can't ultimately maintain a felicity forever by your own resources. Beatitude is supposed to be that happiness that really is a kind of secure, enjoyment of the highest goods that human beings can be united with, ultimately God himself. And in some foreshadowing or qualified way, good relationships with other people, these things that are either equally good as ourselves, other people, or higher goods than we are, God, perhaps angels. It's in union with those kinds of goods that we enjoy our highest sort of flourishing. Now, clearly, the material conditions of our lives here and now make it impossible to achieve ideal beatitude, and yet Boethius thinks we can begin to approximate it or to grow accustomed to it through the pursuit of virtue here and now, whereby we are detached from goods of fortune. We make good use of them. We recognize them as having a good role to play in our lives, but ultimately don't take them to be more important to our flourishing than they really are. And instead to focus on the cultivation of close relationships, relationships of true benevolence instead of just self-serving, and cultivating a life of prayer and godliness that helps us get ready for heaven. So it's because beatitude is, strictly speaking, impossible here and now. We try to settle for other things, for lower things, and often mistake the pursuit of felicity for the pursuit of beatitude, because it's the things that can bring felicity alone. They are often more apparent to us. They have a more immediate attraction in lots of ways. And so part of what philosophy can do for us is to show up the inadequacy of these lower goods for the true happiness that we seek. Philosophy can't achieve that happiness for us. Only God can do that. But it can at least show us that, despite the attraction, the initial appeal, there is something that will ultimately let us down if we place our hope for happiness in these lower goods. And it's not only that. There's this other theme in Boethius that I've been thinking more and more about, even since writing the book, which is that Lady Philosophy makes these several times makes this at first odd claim that attaching ourselves to goods of fortune, staking our hope for happiness on them, is not just foolish in the sense that we won't actually get what we want out of them, but it's also degrading to us. It debases us because we look to something that is in fact less valuable than we are as that thing which, if achieved, will activate our highest human flourishing. So it's like, how could you think that something that is not very valuable could be the highest good of something like you, who are really, really valuable? Only something of even greater worth than you yourself are can be your highest good. And of course, that's God. So this aspect of pursuing lower goods as something that's degrading is I think a less discussed aspect of Lady Philosophy's methods with Boethius. So both their hollowness and their degrading quality. Now that doesn't mean, she's not totally ascetic here. She's not saying, oh, if you care at all about these things, you're like lower than a beast. It's not the use of these goods or the appropriate appreciation of them. It's the attempt to treat them as though they were our final end. That's what's supposed to be debasing.
I'd like to kind of follow up on that too, because in your book you spend a good amount of time reframing this kind of notion of self-destruction, and as it emerges in Boethius. And I think, as I look at, again, the kind of pop cultural appropriation of Stoicism, it typically seems to be in response to a kind of overindulgence, and a kind of a kind of hedonism, in the more kind of casual use of that. But one of the things that's interesting in Boethius, and also I think this emerges in Plato too, which is as rational creatures, we naturally pursue the good, but we do so but we can also become self-destructive in the pursuit of even good things. Would you unpack how that emerges in Boethius, how the principle, how the concept of self-destruction emerges for him, and why you think that factors so importantly in our current conversation about Stoicism and adjacent kind of philosophies?
Yeah. We've been talking about paradoxes. I mean, here's one of the paradoxes: is philosophy is supposed to show us that everything that we do is for the sake of happiness. And yet, so often we do things not only that can't make us happy, but that seem to be really bad for us. And sometimes we do these things on purpose, knowing that they're really bad for us. And, unfortunately, like the limit that, the extreme of this is suicide itself.
Right.
And so in what sense can we suppose that someone is seeking the good even then? And I think it's a difficult teaching. I don't think in the sense that it's difficult because incoherent. I think just even if you understand how the arguments are supposed to work, it's hard to accept, because I think that we are inclined to think of darkness as very powerful, maybe more powerful than it really is. And so the thought that even the suicide is seeking the good can seem just way too naive.
Yeah.
That it doesn't, the sort of a Freudian analysis of human beings as having this sort of death wish.
Right.
It just seems in our own day to resonate more with the destructiveness of human action, both individually and on a mass scale. And yet, I personally want to resist that, and certainly Boethius does too. And there's something, I think, not at all naive about this Boethian claim that we only seek the good. I think it's deeply hopeful. And in some ways, it might be, I think it is rationally grounded. But whatever sort of rational case might be made for it, there's also something about just the goodness of the idea that we always seek the good. That if we could think this about ourselves, instead of, as having death wishes, or as having animal instincts for violence, or as being fundamentally controlled by a libido dominandi, if we could instead think that all of us together, each one of us is pursuing the good, and mistakenly, perversely, whatever, but is pursuing the good, then we can treat each other more charitably. We could treat ourselves more charitably, and we can live more hopefully and avoid despair. So I think there's something, you never want to accept a philosophical position just because it makes you feel good, but
Philosophical felicity.
yeah. But at the same time, if by adopting some point of view, you end up becoming the kind of person that the point of view describes, then you make it true by living as though it were true. And I think there might be something rational about that kind of procedure. But even then, even if that were sufficient on its own, I think that there is something about the idea that we seek the good in everything that we do that is rationally grounded. There's, when you ask, like, well, what's the point of that? It just, there are some hard cases, Augustine and the pairs and stuff. There are some hard cases that make us wonder, well, was that person doing evil for evil's sake, really? Like that, no good at all? And sometimes we might wonder, but ultimately, I think even in the hard cases, we can only make sense of the question, what were you trying to do, or what were you doing, by identifying some good that is pursued. And even in the case of the suicide, Augustine has this, writing about a century before Boethius, has this, I just think, so pastorally sensitive analysis of the suicide as seeking peace. Irrationally, wrongly, yeah. He doesn't paper over those facts, but that peace is what is being sought in that act of self-murder.
Right.
Yeah, that everyone is trying to pursue some good. We just have weak and insufficient wills, and we can't realize it, and we can't always distinguish what is good or for our ultimate beatitude. And I think that's part of the sort of human situation, human finitude.
Yeah.
But one interesting thing, since we're talking about pursuing the good, for Boethius, it seems to be the case that he takes this position that if goodness exists, then God must also exist. That there's this sort of argument for the existence of God from goodness, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's true, do you think that sort of leads us into a sort of Anselmian ontological argument kind of space? And sort of how does that play together?
Yeah, this is really interesting. Anselm is famous for that description of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And it's quite a mouthful. And I remember the first time I encountered the argument as an undergraduate, I couldn't quite parse the syntax, and so I just had a really hard time tracking the argument. But that expression, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, I once tried to trace this back, and it's in Boethius, it's in Augustine, so it goes further than Boethius. And I recently learned that it might be in I think it's Sextus Empiricus. Anyway, I'm right in the middle of trying to drive this down to see just how far back it goes. I think it's implicit, probably, in Plato's form of the good. Certainly, if there is a form of the good, then it is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But in terms of that specific formulation, moving from something like God as the best thing to God as the greatest conceivable thing, that's a definite move. There's a difference there, even though the latter implies the former. So anyway, there is, I think, a kind of proto-ontological argument there in the Consolation of Philosophy. As natural theology goes, it's not the most rigorous argument ever offered, not by a long shot. There might be some questions about what Boethius, the author himself, was trying to achieve there, whether he thought that he could move in a kind of cursory way through an argument for God's existence, because that wasn't what Boethius the prisoner really needed. Maybe that's not actually what would be most helpful for him. It's just a sort of reminder rather than a demonstration. I think that's plausible. Nevertheless, even if Boethius was operating only, at half capacity as a natural theologian, he does, I think, plant the seed of an argument that Anselm would later develop. And I think Anselm is brilliant, and I'm myself am persuaded that there's some version of the argument that is cogent, and that's due to Boethius. So that's really nice. But yeah, this recognition first that we have something like a concept of an ideal state, the good, and that this concept is implicit in our judgments about good and bad all the time. You know, it's we're measuring things up to some notion of goodness, and there's this idea that we have, and that from if we just focus on the idea of goodness itself, we can sort of think through what ideal goodness would be or be like. And it was Anselm ultimately who made the thought that, well, it would be like the best thing would include really existing and not merely being an ideal like in human minds. And so so he supposes that it exists. What Boethius does is more like he doesn't make that inference from existence in our minds to existence in reality. It's more of like a broadly Platonic assumption that to have some concept in mind, if it's a real concept, it automatically has a referent in ideal space, you know, in the Platonic heaven. So then we could establish the existence of the good fairly easily, merely by recognizing that we are in cognitive contact, so to speak, with goodness as such. And then from there, we have these background beliefs about either what God is or what God would have to be in order for God to play the role that he plays in our lives as being worthy of worship, as being the one in whom our happiness alone is found, and so on. And so then with those background beliefs about what God must be, given the way that we relate to him or ought to relate to him, then you can make that identification of God with the good. And I think, like I said, even if he doesn't lay all that out with as great a precision as many other natural theologians do, I think that there's something basically right about that method. It's controversial. I'm not defending that here. I'm just saying that it seems plausible to me, and I think that you know, if you really go to work on it with the metaphysician's toolkit, that you can make a pretty cogent argument out of it. But again, I think, and that in a way, the fact that it's done almost casually attests to Boethius's intelligence, because I think that the argument is playing a certain kind of pedagogical role in the Consolation of Philosophy. And so I speculated that it's not explicated as well as it could be because it's not what Boethius the prisoner needs. But it's just in passing, here's this really creative way to that one might go about demonstrating God's existence if we really needed to do that. And you know, really, between you and me, do we really need to do that? Right. You know, like what are people's objections really to God?
Yeah, that's like a really interesting way to put it too, because it's my mind is sort of taken to like Pascal's wager, right? Mm-hmm. Like Pascal's not trying to make a systematic argument. He's not trying to provide an apologia. He's not sitting down and saying, well, let me prove to you that God exists. Mm-hmm. He's sort of in a witty way, just sort of passing this thing off to you. Mm-hmm. That's like, well, I kind of need to hear this myself.
Yeah.
And be reminded that God exists. And in some small way, maybe this is doing damage to what Boethius is doing. But I sort of read it as Boethius, again, sort of taking it for granted and being like, well, yes, God exists.
Yeah.
And here's this really, you could spend a lot of time here and really get into the nitty gritty, but we're not going to. This isn't what I want to do right now.
Yeah.
Of course, God exists. I'm not trying to convince you that he exists. But it's sort of like what Boethius, the character, needs in the moment that he's interacting with Lady Philosophy there and saying, well, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's something psychologically true about this, that for most people, that, you know, maybe even those who have the disposition and the aptitude to follow philosophical arguments, that really what resistance to God, I think, is very rarely mostly rational.
Right.
I think that we can have experiences or desires or disappointments that make the rational case against God seem rational, or seem, to seem more plausible than the alternative. But both, I just feel like I've been in philosophy long enough to have a sense of what it can and can't do for us, and how it does and doesn't matter really to how we live. And I think it can genuinely be encouraging, consoling, but it's rarely what is the main mover in the choices that we make and the beliefs that we have. I think it can help, but in the case of God, especially, it might sound fideistic, but I think probably it's really more Franciscan, and
Yeah.
well, and that really deep down, I think most people know, and that if they really have persuaded themselves that there is no God, well, usually it has to do with sex.
That's fair. Well, I think that's on that note, that's a bombshell.
Outstanding place. You have to land the plane.
I think we land the plane here. We can move on to our favorite, everyone's favorite section, what we're into. So Dr. Ward, we'll start off with you. What are you into? It can be anything.
I'm into spending more time with my family. I have one trip this week that will conclude a 4-week stretch of lots and lots of travel, and I really miss things like mowing the lawn and like playing volleyball with my teenager, and riding bikes with the little kids, and so that's what I'm into. I'm also at that point of the semester. I mentioned I'm teaching Kant right now, which is total drag. So I'm also at that point in the semester where I'm starting to get tired, and just really looking forward to Thanksgiving week, and doing all the things that we do. I make like 100 jalapeno poppers from scratch, and we just love them. And I always insist that I do them better than anyone I've ever known. So I'm really proud of my jalapeno poppers. So those are some things I'm into. But academically, what am I doing? I'm actually taking a lot of this Boethius material and trying to work some of it out in a little bit more rigorous way than I wanted to do in the book, and see what happens. Try to generate maybe a little bit more interest in Boethius among philosophers, because I really think he gets overlooked. They look at book 5 of Consolation, they see the free will foreknowledge stuff, and they tinker with that, but that's about it. And I think there's a lot more there that philosophers need to pay attention to. So what are you into?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm a dutiful son, and so I have to give a shout out to my loving, wonderful mother. She recently, actually, the end of this month will sort of be my anniversary at the parish that I'm currently at. I've been there for a year now, and so it's been a great place. It's a beautiful parish, beautiful people, and we're growing and good things are happening. But my mother, just because she's a great mother, decided to give me a little present, and she knows that I love. Can't really see it. There are antiques and little things all around.
Yeah, I could see some of them.
Yeah, and so she got me a little desk, an antique desk altar. I don't know if you've seen these. You see them a lot from 18th, 19th century France, but they are beautiful little, sometimes brass, sometimes silver plated things. They have little doors, and there's usually like a crucifix or a medal or an image of a saint or our Lord inside, sort of positioned there, and you place them on your desk, and I think they're there to act as sort of being mindful of holy things. And not that my office currently needs more reminders, because I'm kind of there's a statue of Our Lady of Lourdes, and there's things everywhere. So, but I'm very happy with it. It was a sweet gift, and
that is.
I'm going to enjoy it. So, that's what I'm into right now, and now because it's an interesting thing as an item, I've gone down the rabbit hole of researching them and the history and the reason why. So that's consuming some of my time.
Cool.
Father Hayden, what about you?
Lately, the top of mind right now, as today actually, is this past weekend, I got a chance to go and see the Cold War kids perform live in Costa Mesa, and wow. And it was it was a great kind of reminder of why I like them as a band. I haven't listened to their last couple albums, but I listened to them for many years from their kind of early days. Aside from Dr. Ward, it's one of the best things to come out of Biola, and it was great. They were playing the old stuff, the new stuff, unreleased stuff. And the lead singer's voice has not dipped a bit. He was still nailing all the high notes. It was a lot of fun. So I got to go with Christy and my mom, and we all three of us went, because my mom's also a huge Cold War kids fan. And so, so we were all just kind of jamming there. That was a lot of fun. And then this week, I'm starting to lay the planning and some of the logistics for Thanksgiving. We're doing 2 different Thanksgiving days that we're hosting. And my task in the midst of all that is to do a lot of the baking, and so there's a number of items on the docket. So I'm waking up my sourdough starter right now. Zeno has been hibernating for a little while now, and so he's starting to bubble up and get some good funk. And we're getting ready to start doing a major baking operation over the next 10 days or so. So that's what's occupying my time. It's beautiful here this time of year, and so the weather's perfect for baking bread. So yeah. That's what I've been into.
Awesome.
You've encouraged me now, hearing that, to go wake up Poppy, our starter.
Nice.
So I'm gonna have to do that, because we were on a really solid stretch of baking good sourdough in the house and using it and enjoying it. Things got busy. The dog tore her ACL, and we had to have surgery, and she was limping all around and taking up all our time. And we just sort of got out of the habit of it, and we've been buying sourdough, and it's not as good as making it at home. It just isn't.
Really not.
I was unaware of this custom of naming your starters. I should tell my 14-year-old daughter does. She's a pretty good baker. Sourdough is her specialty, but I'm pretty sure she hasn't named her starter. So I'm going to encourage her to think about this and christen it. Yeah.
We spend a lot of time together. It's a living organism. I have to feed and clean, and it's just it requires a shocking amount of involvement. Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, might as well get acquainted.
Yeah, the Sacramentalists, we recommend you name your sourdough starter.
That's right.
Okay.
And have fun with it.
So these are Zeno and Poppy. Is that what I heard?
Zeno and Poppy, yeah. Xenophilius and Poppy, yeah.
Excellent. She'll have fun with that.
Yeah, I tried. This is maybe for the sort of philosophy and ancient history nerds. My dad, when I was, I think, in high school, it's like, you have to read Cicero, you have to understand Cicero and all these things. So I was like, okay. And so I tried to make a sourdough starter the first go at it when I was maybe in college at some point. And it died horribly. And so I named it Cicero, and I was like, this seems appropriate.
Yeah.
It's fitting.
Yeah. Well, listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Sacramentalists. If you are interested in what we're doing, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. You can like or subscribe on YouTube. Please do. We post all of the videos there. And leave us a rating or a review on iTunes. If you are interested in supporting the show and supporting what we are doing, you can join the Communion of Patreon Saints for just $5 a month. And you get some special access to things like our Discord, where you can chat with us and get into heated theological discussions at your leisure. Dr. Ward, is there anything that you'd like to plug? Any upcoming things you'd like to talk about?
No, I'm like booked out.
Okay.
I mean, in the sense that no more books immediately in the pipeline. I mean, someday, but no, I just want to I want to plug you three and the work that you're doing, and just keep it up, and hopefully anyone who made it this far, listen to the next episode.
Well, we certainly appreciate that. Listeners, please go check out Dr. Ward's recent book. Right now, you can find it, Word on Fire. It's great. And yeah, we're really thankful that you came on today, and we had a great time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Father Hayden, will you close us with a prayer?
Certainly. Let us pray. O most loving Father, who willest us to give thanks for all things, to dread nothing but the loss of Thee, and to cast all our care on Thee who carest for us, preserve us from faithless fears and worldly anxieties, and grant that no clouds of this mortal life may hide from us the light of that love which is immortal, and which Thou hast manifested unto us in Thy Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.